right, World War One explanation assignment explanation. So we're going to read this and we're going to answer the questions out. We will go over the questions together as we do this. So I hope this helps. I hope this helped yesterday. If you did it, if it's your first time, welcome. So the essential question: why do politics often lead to war? How can technology impact war? The war that many thought would be over in a few weeks lasted for longer, resulting in many casualties on both sides. The war widened, and the United States entered the fray in 1917. As World War I escalated, governments took control of their economies, rationing food and supplies and calling on civilians to work and make sacrifices for the war effort. 1814 to 1915, illusions and stalemate. The guiding question: how did the war on the Eastern Front differ from the war on the Western Front? Before 1914, many political leaders believed war to be impractical because it involved so many political and economic risks. Others believed that diplomats could easily prevent war. In August 1914, both ideas were shattered. However, the new illusions that replaced them soon proved to be equally foolish. Government propaganda, ideas that are spread to influence public opinion for or against the cause, had stirred national hatreds before the war. Now in August 1914, the urgent pleas of European governments for defense against aggressors fell on receptive ears in every nation that was at war. Most people seemed generally convinced that their nation's cause was just. A new set of illusions also fed the enthusiasm for war. In August 1914, almost everyone believed that war would be over in a few weeks. After all, almost all European wars since 1815 had in fact ended in a matter of weeks. Soldiers who boarded the trains for the war front in August 1914 and the jubilant citizens who saw them off believed that their warriors would be home by Christmas. So, propaganda was used during the war to convince, people that their nations were justified in going to war. B, political leaders that war was impractical because it involved so many political and economic risks. C, convince diplomats that they could easily prevent war. Or D, convince people that their nations should no longer participate in such a large war. The correct answer for number 1 is A, to convince people that their nations were justified in going to war. The Western Front, which we brought up in our PowerPoint yesterday. German hopes for a quick end to the war rested on a military gamble. The Schlieffen Plan called for the German army to make a vast encircling movement through Belgium into northern France. According to the plan, the German forces would sweep around Paris to enable them to surround most of the French army. However, the German advance was halted a short distance from Paris at the First Battle of the Marne. To stop the Germans, French military leaders loaded 2,000 Parisian taxicabs with fresh troops and sent them to the front line. The war quickly turned into a stalemate as neither the Germans nor the French could dislodge each other from the trenches they had dug for shelter. 2 lines of trenches soon reached from the English Channel to the frontiers of Switzerland. The Western Front had become bogged down in trench warfare. Both sides were kept in virtually the same position for 4 years. For question 2, a consequence of trench warfare on the Western Front was A, it forced alliances to form. B, it produced many stalemates and kept both sides in the same position for long periods of time. C, it forced the Germans to fight a war on 2 fronts. D, it led to a quick end to the war. The correct answer for number 2 is B. It produced many stalemates and kept both sides in the same positions for long periods of time. The Eastern Front. Unlike the Western Front, the war on the Eastern Front was marked by mobility. The cost in lives, however, was equally enormous. At the beginning of the war, the Russian army moved into eastern Germany, but was decisively defeated at the Battle of Tannenberg on August 30th and the Battle of Moserine Lakes on September 15th. After these defeats, the Russians were no longer a threat to Germany. Austria-Hungary, Germany's ally, fared far less well at first. The Austrians had been defeated by the Russians in Galicia and thrown out of Serbia as well. To make matters worse, the Italians betrayed their German and Austrian allies in the Triple Alliance by attacking Austria in May 1915. Italy thus joined France, Great Britain, and Russia, who had previously been known as the Triple Entente, but now were called the Allied Powers or Allies. By this time, the Germans had come to the aid of the Austrians. A German-Austrian army defeated the Russian army in Galicia and pushed the Russians far back into their own territory. Russian casualties stood at 2.5 million killed, captured, or wounded. The Russians were almost knocked out of the war. Encouraged by the success against Russia, Germany and Austria-Hungary, joined by Bulgaria, in September 1915 attacked and eliminated Serbia from the war. Their success in the east would enable the German troops to move back to the offensive in the west. So question 3, the battles on the Eastern Front. A. Produced massive Russian casualties. B. Featured far more mobility than the battles on the Western Front. C. Was where the Italians switched sides during the middle of the war. Or D. All answers are correct. The correct answer for number 3 is D. All answers are correct. Trench and air warfare. Guiding question. What made World War I more devastating than any previous wars? On the Western Front, the trenches dug in 1914 had by 1916 become elaborate systems of defense. The Germans and French each had hundreds of miles of trenches, which were protected by barbed wire entanglements up to 5 feet high and 30 yards wide. Concrete machine gun nests and other gun batteries, supported further back by heavy artillery, protected the trenches. Troops lived in holes in the ground separated from each other by a strip of territory known as no man's land. Trench warfare baffled military leaders who had been trained to fight wars of movement and maneuver. At times, the high command on either side would order an offensive that would begin with an artillery barrage to flatten the enemy's barbed wire and leave them in a state of shock. After softening up the enemy in this fashion, a mass of soldiers would climb out of their trenches with fixed bayonets and hope to work their way toward the enemy trenches. The attacks rarely worked because men advancing unprotected across open fields could be fired at by the enemy's machine guns. In 1916 and 1917, millions of young men died in their search for the elusive breakthrough. In just 10 months at Verdun, France, 700,000 men lost their lives over a few miles of land. World War I had turned into a war of attrition, a war based on wearing down the other side with constant attacks and heavy losses. By the end of 1915, airplanes appeared on the battlefront for the first time in history. Planes were first used to spot the enemy's position. Soon planes also began to attack ground targets, especially enemy communications. Fights for control of the airspace occurred and then increased over time. At first, pilots fired at each other with handheld pistols. Later, machine guns were mounted on the noses of planes, which made the skies considerably more dangerous. The Germans also used their giant airships, the Zeppelins, to bomb London and eastern England. This caused little damage but frightened many people. Germany's enemies, however, soon found that Zeppelins, which were filled with hydrogen gas, quickly became raging infernos when hit by anti-aircraft guns. So question 4 says trenches can best be described as A. Holes in the ground, which eventually became almost tunnel-like because there were so many of them. B. Airplane battles fought above the battlefields on the Western Front. C. Giant airships which bombed major European cities. D. Ground attacks, which were first fought with handheld pistols but later used machine guns. The correct answer for 4 would be A. Holes in the ground, which eventually became almost tunnel-like because there were so many of them. A world war. Guiding question. Why did the war widen to become a world conflict? Because of the stalemate on the Western Front, both sides sought to gain new allies. Each side hoped new allies would provide a winning advantage as well as a new source of money and war goods. Widening of the war. Entry of the United States. At first, the United States tried to remain neutral. As World War I dragged on, however, it became more difficult to do so. The immediate cause of the United States' involvement grew out of the naval war between Germany and Great Britain. Britain had used its superior navy to set up a blockade of Germany. The blockade kept war materials and other goods from reaching Germany by sea. Germany in turn set up its own blockade of Britain and enforced it with the use of unrestricted submarine warfare, including the sinking of passenger liners. On May 7, 1915, German forces sank the British ship Lusitania. About 1,100 civilians, including more than 100 Americans, died. After strong protests from the United States, the German government suspended unrestricted submarine warfare in September 1915 to avoid antagonizing the United States further. Only once did the Germans and British engage in direct naval battle, at the Battle of Jutland on May 31, 1916. Neither side won a conclusive victory. By January 1917, however, the Germans were eager to break the deadlock in the war. German naval officials were quite wrong. German naval officials convinced Emperor William II that resuming the use of unrestricted submarine warfare could starve the British into submission within 6 months. When the Emperor expressed concern about the United States, German Admiral Holzendorf assured him, "I give you majesty my word as an officer that not one American will land on the continent." The German naval officers were quite wrong. The British were not forced to surrender, and the return to unrestricted warfare brought the United States into the war in April 1917. U.S. troops did not arrive in large numbers in Europe until 1918. However, the entry of the United States into the war gave the Allied powers a psychological boost and a major new source of money and war goods. Bulgaria entered the war on the side of the Central Powers as Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire were called. Russia, Great Britain, and France, the Allied powers, declared war on the Ottoman Empire. The Allies tried to open a Balkan front by landing forces at Gallipoli, southwest of Constantinople, in April 1915. However, the campaign was disastrous and the Allies withdrew. By 1917, the war had truly become a world conflict. That year, while stationed in the Middle East, a British officer, known as Lawrence of Arabia, urged Arab princes to revolt against the Ottoman overlords. In 1918, British forces from Egypt mobilized troops from India, Australia, and New Zealand and worked to destroy the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. The Allies took advantage of Germany's preoccupations in Europe and lack of naval strength to seize German colonies in the rest of the world. Japan, a British ally, beginning in 1902, seized a number of German-held islands in the Pacific. Austria seized German New Guinea. So 5. Why would the British set up a naval blockade on Germany? Is it A, to anger the United States, B, to convince the United States to join the war, to join their side in the war, C, to prevent the Germans from invading Great Britain, or D, to prevent the Germans from importing supplies needed for their war efforts? The correct answer for 5 is D. 6. Who did Lawrence of Arabia help? A, the Ottoman Empire, B, the United States, C, the Central Powers, D, Arab princes. The correct answer for 6 is D, Arab princes. And then 7. What brought the United States into World War I? Is it A, the German reintroduction of unrestricted submarine warfare, B, the British reintroduction of unrestricted submarine warfare, C, the German naval blockade of Great Britain, or D, the Battle of Jutland? The correct answer for that, for number 7, is A, the impact of total war. What was the impact of total war is the guiding question. As World War I dragged on, it became a total war involving a complete mobilization of resources and people. It affected the lives of all citizens in the warring countries, however far from the battlefields. The home front was rapidly becoming a cause for as much effort as the war front. So 8, total war affects A, everybody in the world, B, the lives of all citizens in warring countries, C, soldiers in the battlefields, D, politicians and religious leaders only. The correct answer for 8 would be B, the lives of all citizens in warring countries. Increased government powers. Crazy thing. Most people had expected the war to be short. Little thought had been given to long-term wartime needs. Governments had to respond quickly, however, when the new machines failed to achieve their goals. Many more men and supplies were needed to continue the war effort. To meet these needs, governments expanded their powers. Countries drafted tens of millions of young men, hoping for that elusive breakthrough to victory. Wartime governments throughout Europe also expanded their power over their economies. Free market capitalistic systems were temporarily put aside. Governments set up price, wage, and rent controls. They also rationed food supplies and materials, regulated imports and exports, and took over transportation systems and industry. In effect, in order to mobilize all the resources of their nations for the war effort, European nations set up planned economies. As a result of total war mobilization, the differences between soldiers at war and citizens at home were narrowed. In the view of political leaders, all citizens were part of a national army that was dedicated to victory. Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, said that the men and women who remain to till the soil and man the factories are no less a part of the army than the men beneath the battle flags. So 9, why would government set up price, wage, and rent controls while also rationing food supplies and materials? Was it A, they wanted to set up free market capitalistic systems? B, they wanted to make sure that all of their resources went towards their war efforts? C, they wanted to make sure that the transportation systems and industries thrived? Or D, they wanted to make sure that civilian businesses still thrived? The correct answer for number 9 would be B. Manipulation of public opinion. As the war continued and casualties worsened, the patriotic enthusiasm that marked the early stages of the war began to wane. By 1916, signs indicated that civilian morale was beginning to crack. War governments, however, fought back against growing opposition to the war. Authoritarian regimes, such as those of Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary, relied on force to subdue their populations. With the pressure of the war, however, even democratic states expanded their police powers to stop internal dissent. The British Parliament, for example, passed the Defence of the Realm Act, DORA. It allowed the government to arrest protesters as traitors. Newspapers were censored, and sometimes publication was suspended. Wartime governments made active use of propaganda to increase enthusiasm for the war. As the war progressed and morale sagged, governments were forced to devise new techniques for motivating citizens. So 10, during the war, individual freedoms thrived, A. B, individual freedoms decreased significantly. C, propaganda was used to force governments out of the war. Or D, citizens are more motivated than ever to fight for their countries. The correct answer for 10 would be B. Total war and society. In the fall of 1918, a deadly influenza struck, adding to the horrors of World War I. Probably spread by soldiers returning from the front, influenza became the deadliest epidemic in the war. An estimated total of 50 million people died worldwide. Total war also had a significant impact on European society. World War I created new roles for women. Because so many men left to fight at the front, women were asked to take over jobs that were not available to them before. Women found themselves employed in jobs that were once considered beyond their capacity. Their jobs included civilian occupations such as chimney sweeps, truck drivers, farm laborers, and factory workers in heavy industry. For example, 38% of the workers in the crop armaments works in Germany were, in 1918, were women. The place of women in the workforce was far from secure, however. Both men and women seemed to expect that many of the new jobs for women were only temporary. At the end of the war, as men returned to the job market, governments quickly removed women from the jobs they were encouraged to take earlier. By 1919, 650,000 women in Great Britain were unemployed. Wages for the women who were still unemployed were lowered. Nevertheless, in some countries, the role women played in wartime economies had a positive impact on the women's movement for social and political emancipation. The most obvious gain was the right to vote, which was given to women in Germany, Austria, and the United States immediately after the war. British women over the age of 30 gained the right to vote, together with the right to stand for Parliament in 1918. Many upper and middle class women also gained freedoms. In ever-increasing numbers, young women from these groups took jobs, lived in their own apartments, and relished their new independence. So question 11 asks, generally speaking, during the war and immediately following the war, A, women lost many rights and individual freedoms. B. Women were forced to fight on the battlefields for the first time. C. Women were given more responsibilities and given more individual freedoms. Or D. Women were primarily responsible for the escalation of war. The correct answer for 11 is C. I hope this helped. We will talk to you tomorrow.